Hey guys, tonight we're wandering into something a little peculiar. Not quite the kind of strange that startles you awake, but the slow twisting kind that feels like a dream wrapped in old incense and silk. Welcome to Song Dynasty China. The year is 1127. The empire is vast. Its scrolls are inked with rules older than memory, and the streets hum with traders, monks, poets, and you. You're a man of modest means and strange authority. Not a judge, not a soldier, but something far more unusual. You are a Superstition-Enforcer. Your job is not to guard the city walls or arrest thieves. Your duty is to watch for broken taboos, missed lunar rites, inauspicious haircuts, and unlucky door charms that might bring ruin to a neighbour's house. It is, in many ways, a job no one respects but everyone fears. Because in a world ruled by calendars, spirits, and unseen energies, someone has to ensure the rules are followed. Even the ridiculous ones. Before we drift any deeper into this peculiar old world, if you're enjoying what I do here, these soft slips through forgotten lives and dusty corners of history, go ahead and tap the like button and subscribe. Only if you feel it's earned, of course. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is in your part of the world. Leave a comment if you're up for it. I always find it strangely comforting seeing this sleepy little circle stretch across so many time zones. All right then, dim your lights. Let the whir of a fan or the hum of night fill the space around you. Get settled, and let's begin the story. Your bed is made of lacquered bamboo slats with a wool mat spread over it. Not the plushest surface in the empire, but better than the earthen floors most peasants sleep on. You wake with the light, always with the light, because superstition demands it. A superstition enforcer cannot rise after the sun. That's the rule. If the sun beats you out of bed, it's said your luck will flow away like ink dropped in water. You sit up slowly, spine crackling, joints stiff from the night air. The window is paper-screened, already glowing faintly with morning light. And the room smells like cooled lamp oil and boiled rice. Somewhere, a rooster offers his unrequested opinion of the day. You shuffle to your watering bowl. The water is cold, drawn the night before from the garden urn. There is no soap, only a square cloth, a splash, and the knowledge that clean skin invites good fortune. You rinse quickly, splashing your face, and reach for your robe. It is dull green today, because red, while lucky on festival days, is forbidden on this one. It's the 5th day of the 5th lunar month, the day of double yang, auspicious in theory, but dangerous if mishandled. People will be nervous. They always are on days like this. You eat standing up. A bowl of warm congee, rice porridge with a sliver of pickled mustard leaf and a soft-boiled egg that tastes more like the pot than the egg itself. You sip from a chipped cup of tea, leaves floating gently, steam curling like the temple smoke. You eat quickly because lateness carries bad energy, and today your schedule is thick with nonsense. A woman in the West Quarter claims her neighbour hung his family's charms upside down again. A shopkeeper reported a beggar sweeping his storefront from the inside out, which apparently invites financial ruin. And there's the usual inspection at the tailor's alley. Someone always forgets that it's bad luck to finish a robe before the customer tries it on. Your sandals scrape the courtyard stones as you step outside. The city breathes around you. Birds chirp from under eaves. A street vendor down the lane clangs a bell, hawking dumplings too oily for breakfast. A boy runs past, holding a wind charm that flutters and clinks and is sending a soft shimmer of bells behind him. The air is already warm and wet. The smell of steamed buns mixes with horse dung and last night's cabbage soup, emptied into drains. This is the world you work in, where logic ends and custom begins. You're not loved, you're not feared, you're watched. Because you hold the authority to fine someone for singing a morning tune on a wedding day, or for planting bamboo during an unlucky moon. And in this city, where people cling to rituals like old lovers, your word, absurd as it sounds, is law. The alley you turn into first is barely wider than your shoulders. Clay tiles drip from last night's storm, and each step brings the squelch of water rising up through stone cracks. You know this lane well. It smells faintly of boiled fabric and fermented bean water, the scent of tailors at work. Here, among the spools and silks, is one of your least favourite duties. Robe inspections. You would think something as mundane as robe making would fall outside the realm of celestial concern, but it does not. Not in this city. There are rules about how robes must be stitched during certain months, about which threads may be used during a waning moon, and how the final knot must be tied with the customer facing north, but only if the robe is blue. A tailor once wept openly when you told her she'd unknowingly completed a child's mourning robe under the wrong zodiac sign. She had to burn the whole garment and smear her doorstep with fish oil to ward off the ill fortune. You don't enjoy enforcing these things, but you do them anyway, because the law is not always about logic. Sometimes it's about belief, and belief once hardened bends to no one. You pause outside the familiar shop with the cracked red lantern above the door. The sign reads Master Lin's Robes of Virtue, though Lin himself hasn't stitched a thing in over a year. Age has stiffened his fingers and stolen his eyesight. His daughter May does the work now, though officially she is still just an apprentice. You push the door open and step into a room steeped in the smell of damp silk, candle wax, and something mildly sour. Bolts of fabric line the walls. A spinning wheel clicks gently in the back. May looks up, needle paused, her mouth forming the soft line of someone who has just remembered it's the 5th day of the 5th month. She bows respectfully, setting aside her work. "Esteemed keeper of auspicious order," she says, her voice light but guarded. No one uses your official title unless they're hoping to avoid trouble. You nod, pretending not to notice the half-finished robe on the stand beside her. The thread is green on double yang. Technically allowed, though barely. It's not the colour that bothers you, it's the placement of the final knot. Left shoulder, again, that same shoulder she used last time. You exhale slowly, not ready to reprimand her, not yet. She notices your gaze and moves to stand between you and the garment, as though her body could shield it from your judgment. "I was only aligning the hem," she says quickly, eyes downcast. "The knot will wait for the client." You believe her. Probably. She's sharp, careful, too smart to test the laws directly. But even care can slip on a day like today. You glance around the room and let the silence stretch. Then you say gently, "You may want to recite the water dragon blessing, just in case." She nods, grateful for the warning instead of a penalty. You turn without another word and step back into the street, leaving behind the tension of tight stitches and tighter rules. Further down, a rickety door opens into the spice merchant's shop. You weren't planning to stop there, but an old woman on the last block muttered something about cinnamon spilled in the wrong direction. You don't know if that's actually a recognised misfortune, but once a complaint is spoken aloud, you're bound to investigate it. So you step into a cloud of clove and star anise. The air inside is thick, humid, and oddly sweet. Shelves groan under sacks of powders and dried roots. The merchant, a man with long silver hairs twisting from his chin like tassels, greets you with a wary smile. "Is it my turn again?" he asks with a sigh. You shrug. "Depends. Did your apprentice clean the mortar sunwise or moonwise this morning?" The man groans. "Moonwise is mother's idea. She thinks it calms the ginger." You shake your head slowly. That's not the proper method, especially not on a day like this. Moonwise grinding brings dream trouble. Children cry in their sleep. Pregnant women get unsettled dreams. These things are whispered truths in the back lanes of the city. And while you don't entirely believe them, belief is a living thing here. The merchant doesn't argue. He nods, then begins unpacking a bundle of fresh orange peel, setting it on the counter to rebalance the scent in the room. You write nothing down, not yet. Sometimes the record is worse than the act. A public note can stain a man's business. Instead, you whisper, burn 3 sticks of bitter root, and change apprentice is half joke, half advice. He laughs, low and dry like a wheeze. You leave before he can thank you. Outside, the sky has turned the colour of wet rice paper. Clouds drift low. Somewhere a monk rings a small temple bell, soft and distant. You pause at a crossing where a beggar is sweeping the stone path with a handmade broom. You stiffen, watching the motion of his hand. He's sweeping inward, toward the home behind him, not outward. That's bad, very bad. Pulling in dirt is said to bring misfortune from the street into the heart of the house. A child could fall ill. A father could lose his wage. A daughter might cut her hair on an unlucky day. You should stop him. But something holds you. Maybe it's the slow rhythm of his sweeping. Maybe it's the way his shoulders hunch, tired and indifferent to fate. Or maybe, just maybe, you're starting to wonder if some rules are simply too much, even for you. The sweep of the broom faded behind you, swallowed by the mutter of carts and sandals on stone, and yet the unease lingered. You'd walked past the beggar's doorway many times before, always noticing the little altar wedged between 2 crates and a rusted basin. A sliver of red cloth hung above it, fluttering like a tired banner. But today, something was missing. The incense jar, empty, cold, no smoke, no offering, and that, more than the reverse sweeping, settled like a stone behind your ribs. In this city, the gods were fed daily, not the high temple deities with their grand shrines and polished brass idols. Those were for festival days and nobles. The gods that truly mattered to your kind of people were the house spirits, the alley guardians, the stove god, the gutter demon, the spirit of the 5th tile. These were the ones who watched quietly from door frames and rafters. They kept the rats from your flour, the wind from your roof, the sickness from your sleeping mat. But they were hungry gods, needy and quick to anger. If you forgot them, especially on a day like today, well, it was said they didn't forget you. You turned another corner and slowed as you reached the bridge over Moon Canal. It wasn't much of a canal anymore, more a sluggish stream that gathered fish guts, old shoes and half-sung prayers, but it had a proper stone arch, and carved into its base was a lion, or maybe a turtle, depending on the season and the storyteller. People passed you on both sides, some nodding, others looking away. No one wanted your attention. Not this morning, especially not now. At the base of the bridge, a group of children played with paper cranes, trying to balance them on the current. Their giggles were bright, but it was the old man standing behind them who caught your eye. He was watching them too closely. Not fondly, cautiously. His robes were patched but well kept, his hair tied properly. You'd seen him before. Teacher Wen, they called him. Used to run a small school out of his courtyard before his wife died and his sons left for the south. Now he mostly wandered the streets, muttering to himself and correcting passer-by on improper festival greetings. You didn't plan to stop, but he raised a hand before you could pass. His fingers trembled. "Keeper," he said, voice thin as parchment. "You should look behind the water stall near the lantern shop. Someone's painted over a wall charm." You frowned. That wasn't just a mistake. That was tampering. Wall charms were poor. You couldn't simply erase one because it faded or clashed with your new paint. They had to be burned properly, the ashes buried under a sour fruit tree. Everyone knew that, or so you thought. You nodded curtly and turned away. The lantern shop was on your path anyway. As you walked, the city's rhythm settled into your bones again. A boy beat a rug over a railing. A woman haggled over the price of ginger candy. 2 crows argued loudly over a discarded fishtail. And yet, through it all, your ears stayed sharp, tuned not to the noise of the city, but to its silences. A festival drum that hadn't sounded. A chant left unfinished. A window where firecrackers had been stacked backward. You reached the lantern shop and slipped around the side alley. The wall behind the water stall was narrow, shadowed. And there it was, the charm. A small square talisman that should have been printed with vermilion ink. A symbol of blessing pressed into yellow paper. Instead, it had been half covered in whitewash. Only the top corners showed. 2 tiny fox faces peeking out from beneath the paint, like ghosts trying to breathe. You stared at it a long time, longer than you meant to. Who would do this? Not by accident. The paint was careful, deliberate. You knelt, pressing your fingers to the edge of the charm, still slightly tacky. Whoever did this, they did it recently. A message? A prank? Or just ignorance pretending to be progress? From the edge of your sleeve, you drew a small blade and cut the charm loose. You folded it gently twice and tucked it into the pocket sewn into your sash. You'd burn it later. Properly. Alone. The sky above the alley was beginning to dim, clouds thickening into the promise of rain. You felt it in your neck, the stiffness that came before a downpour, and in your chest, something else. That quiet weight that always returned after too many small wrongs stacked together like brittle paper. You turned back toward the street, pausing only to glance at the cracked clay pot that had been placed by the stall's edge. It should have held a sprig of plum blossom for the festival. Instead, it was filled with ash. By the time you reached the Rooster Market, the first fat drops of rain had begun to fall. Not the sharp, sudden kind that comes with wind, but the slow, deliberate type that seems to seep into the bones of the city before it even touches the ground. You pulled your sleeves over your hands as you moved along the covered walkway. The air was thick with the scent of wet feathers, rotting straw, and the unmistakable sweetness of overripe lychee. It clung to your robe, to your thoughts, to the skin behind your ears. The Rooster Market was no place for refinement. Even the spirits kept their distance, or so the old men joked. Your reason for being here, however, was no joke. A report had come just 2 days ago. A shopkeeper, anxious and whispering, claimed someone had broken a taboo, offered a white rooster to the stove god during the waxing moon. That was not just superstition, that was near sacrilege. White roosters were reserved for funerals, and even then, only in the 7th month, under a new moon. To offer one to a household god outside that time was to ask for sickness, misfortune, or worse, silence from the gods. No protection, no blessing. A house left spiritually empty. You passed cages stacked shoulder high, roosters crying out in wet protest. Their feathers gleamed dull beneath the rain-soaked awning. A young man leaned against a cart, chewing plum pit and pretending not to notice you. You knew the type, knew the rhythm of a guilty vendor trying to look like part of the scenery. You approached slowly, letting the silence stretch. "Do you sell for offerings?" you asked without ceremony. The boy flinched but recovered fast, eyes flicking from your badge to your mud-spattered hem. "Only what the buyer requests," he said too quickly. "We don't ask what it's for." You nodded once, not because you believed him, but because that lie was the one every merchant told. You stepped closer and looked down at the crate near his feet. Half covered with straw, a single bird shifted uneasily. It was white, too white. Not the creamy kind with russet tail feathers, but pure, unsettling white. A funeral bird. "How many?" you asked softly. He hesitated, licked his lips. "Only 3, he said. "Gone by yesterday, 1 to a woman in mourning, 1 to a scholar, 1 to a man from the North District. Had a scar on his jaw." You let the rain fill the silence again. Somewhere behind you a rooster crowed once and then fell silent. You turned away from the boy, leaving his crate untouched. You had what you needed. Now you only needed to find the scarred man from the North District. But you wouldn't go there yet. Not today, not with the rain and the feeling that the city itself was curling inward like damp paper. Instead, you walked back toward the main road, letting your steps slow. The street glistened now, every cobble and crack filled with tiny mirrors of sky. People hurried past, clutching their robes, ducking under fabric awnings. A monk walked barefoot, his bowl covered, head bowed, murmuring prayers to the pavement. You nodded in his direction. He didn't see you. As you passed the herbalist's courtyard, the scent of camphor and red bean paste drifted out toward you. For a moment your stomach growled. You hadn't eaten since morning, but the hunger wasn't really about. food. It was about the heaviness in your chest, the weight of too many violations left uncorrected, the echo of charms painted over, gods forgotten, roosters wrongly slain. You'd chosen this job once, believed in its purpose. You told yourself then that you were protecting something sacred. Not just rules, harmony, balance, the invisible threads that held the city together like a finely stitched robe, but lately the threads felt loose. And you weren't sure if anyone still cared. You stopped beneath the awning of a tea house, listening to the sound of rain tapping against hollow bamboo gutters. A woman inside was playing the guqin, slow and low, a scale that never resolved, a tune without a name. You stood there a while, not moving, not thinking, just breathing in the scent of rain and wet wood, listening to a melody that might have been centuries old or made up on the spot. And in that quiet moment, you wondered, was the scarred man merely ignorant, or did he mean to disrupt something deeper? There were whispers lately, after all, people questioning the old rites, saying they were relics, laughing at the rules, laughing at you. The guqin plucked another note. Distant thunder rolled behind the rooftops. You pulled your robe tighter and turned back toward the path. The rain had lightened but not stopped, and neither had the work. The rain had thinned into mist by the time you reached the edge of the North District. Here, the streets narrowed again, as if the city itself grew shy of its own shape. The stone beneath your sandals changed texture, smoother, older, with grooves worn deep by generations of carts and careless feet. The houses leaned a little closer to each other, their windows shuttered tight, their doorways marked with fading talismans. This part of the city was older than law, older than records. Here, tradition wasn't just followed, it had fermented. The scarred man was said to live near the incense well. You didn't know his name, but names weren't always necessary in a city like this. Sometimes a face and a bad decision were enough. You asked no questions, made no announcements. You simply moved, eyes alert, ears open, following the rhythm of conversation that dried on tongues the moment people saw your sash. Eventually, a cobbler's apprentice pointed down a crooked alley with a nod of his chin. "The house with the moss on the right-hand wall," he whispered, then quickly looked away. You found it just where he said, a small structure with cracked beams and a door slightly warped by years of humid seasons. The moss ran in a green line like a slow-moving stain across the outer stones. You paused in front of it. No incense burned outside, no offering bowl, no god shelf in the doorway. A house without spirit rituals was like a body with no heartbeat. You knew then that something was wrong long before the door opened. It opened slowly without a sound. A man stood there, tall and lean, his jaw marked by a scar that twisted like a river seen from far above. He wore a dark robe with the belt tied off centre, already another small omen of disorder. His eyes didn't flicker when he saw you. Instead, they held yours with a quiet boldness that bordered on defiance. "I know why you've come," he said, voice flat as a stone floor. You didn't respond at first, just studied the lines on his face, the faint incense burns on his sleeves. Ironic for a man who no longer burned incense. "Then you know what offering a white rooster means." "I know what people think it means," he replied. And that was the moment you realised. This wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. You stepped into his courtyard without asking. He didn't stop you. The space inside was clean, empty in a deliberate way. No charms above the lintels, no protective symbols etched into the brick. Just plain walls, a few rain-wet sandals by the door, and a stone basin half filled with rainwater and what looked like ashes. You leaned in, not wood ashes, paper. Yellow fibres clung together in the wet, and your stomach turned. "You burned your family's talismans." He didn't answer, didn't need to. You straightened slowly, meeting his gaze again. "Why?" He took a breath, the kind people take before speaking a thing they've never said out loud. "Because they don't work. Because we follow rules written before our grandfathers were born and still people die. Children fall ill. Homes collapse. We sweep our courtyards the right way, offer the right meat on the right day, and still we suffer. You said nothing. Let the silence sit between you like a third person. He went on. I watch my mother chant the stove god prayer every morning, burn fish oil every full moon. She died coughing blood into a rag that smelled like lotus leaves. No god came, no spirit stopped to watch. You studied him carefully. This was no rebel with a cause. He was tired, hollowed out by grief more than anger. You'd seen it before. People didn't stop believing out of arrogance. They stopped because belief had failed them. Still, rules were rules. You know I have to report this, you said quietly. The rooster, the burn charms, the ash basin. I know. Why not run? He looked around his small courtyard. Where would I go? The sky has no rules, but people carry them anyway. For a moment you envied his clarity, even if it came dressed in ruin. Then you reached into your robe and pulled out a fresh talisman. Not the official kind, not one meant for public record. Just a simple household charm, folded by your own hand, ink still sharp. You laid it on the edge of his basin and turned to leave. You think that'll fix something? He called after you. You paused. No, but I don't think it'll hurt. As you stepped back into the narrowing mist, your fingers brushed the hidden pouch in your sleeve, where you kept the charm from the painted wall. It felt heavier than before, or maybe it was just the city pressing down again, wrapping itself around your shoulders like wet silk. You didn't know what you'd write in your report. Not yet, but you knew this wouldn't be the last house without incense, and that worried you more than any charm ever could. You walked without speaking to anyone for the next stretch of street, letting your thoughts settle into the rhythm of your steps, one slow slap of sandal after another on rain-slick stone. The drizzle had thinned to a drizzle so light it was more memory than weather. It clung to the air like breath held too long, wrapping the city in a hush, as if it too was waiting for something unspeakable to pass. You didn't try to rush the feeling away, you let it stay. The man with the scar had said what others only muttered, in the corners of their homes, behind the hands under the breath of the night. The old ways were fraying. You passed a row of houses where the door charms were curled from water damage. Most had been pressed up months ago and forgotten. They hung like tired eyebrows over wooden lintels. Some were discoloured to the point of absurdity, their once read script now ghostly pink, unreadable even by the gods they were meant to summon. But no one had replaced them. And the thing was, no one seemed afraid. That was new. Years ago, even a child would cry if a charm fell off the door. Now, people barely noticed. Or noticed and chose not to care. Ahead, at the far end of the winding lane, you spotted old Madame Gu's shrine. You hadn't planned to check it, but some places pulled at your attention even before logic caught up. Her door had once been famous in the district. Painted yearly in crimson, lined with scalloped gold paper, flanked by twin statues of the door gods, one holding a sword, the other a smile that had grown more sinister with age. You paused at the corner and watched the scene before stepping into it. The shrine was still there, but someone had closed it improperly. The offerings were untouched. A bowl of rice now clumped and blackened with mould. 2 sticks of incense stood dry and unlit. The oil lamp had collapsed inward, a sad puddle of smoke-stained glass. And on the ground, pressed under a stone, was a petition slip. That caught your breath. Petition slips were meant to be tied to prayer trees, burned in temple fires, or handed directly to monks, never left on the ground, never crushed under a stone. You crouched and lifted it carefully. The writing was shaky, as though the hand that penned it hadn't eaten well in weeks. The message was short, just 5 characters, 3 for daughter, 1 for sick, and 1 smeared, perhaps meant to say mercy. No name, no date, just need, inked into fragility. You looked around, but the street was empty. A cartwheel creaked in the far distance. The wind moved in and out of the alley, like a thief reconsidering his options. You sat there for a long moment beside the shrine, your fingers still clutching the slip. It shouldn't be like this, you thought. Even in poverty, there had always been order. Rituals gave structure to suffering, a rhythm to pain. You offered, you burned, you prayed, you endured. The cycle was sacred, not because it was magical, but because it made things bearable. But now people were not just forgetting, they were choosing to forget. That choice frightened you more than ghosts. When you rose again, your knees ached. You tucked the slip into your sleeve just beside the charm from the lantern shop and the folded paper from the scarred man's courtyard. Your robe felt heavy with all the belief others had abandoned. The city around you seemed to have grown quieter, though whether from the hour or the mood you couldn't say. The clouds thickened above but didn't open. Instead, they gathered like onlookers, waiting to see what came next. You turned south again, toward the lower market. There was still one inspection left today, a shop that sold ancestral brushes, the kind used to write names on spirit registers and memorial tablets, a delicate business. If even one stroke was written wrong, it was said the ancestor would lose their way, wandering between worlds, neither living nor dead. A punishment not just for the soul, but for the descendants too. You did not relish these visits. The shopkeeper, Mr. Feng, was courteous but uneasy. The last time you came, he'd spilled ink across an entire tray of temple slips in his panic. You'd helped him clean it, said nothing, wrote no violation. You didn't want to frighten a people. You only wanted to keep the fabric of the world from unravelling. But it was starting to feel like you were the only one left holding the thread. The path to Mr. Feng's shop passed beneath a low archway where ivy clung like tired fingers to crumbling stone. A soft breeze tugged at your sleeves as you walked, and the scent of damp wood mingled with the faintest whiff of ink and dust. The alley had narrowed with age, as if the city itself wanted to keep this part hidden. Even the birds above grew quiet when you neared the brushmaker's threshold, their chirping fading into a stillness that clung to the tiled eaves like a secret. You paused at the threshold out of habit, pressing your palm gently against the carved stone lion perched at the door's edge. Its nose had been worn smooth by decades of anxious fingers, mostly from customers hoping their brushes would carry the right spirit. You added your touch to the tradition, not for belief but out of respect, and stepped inside. The interior of Mr. Feng's shop was dim, lit only by two hanging lanterns swaying gently in the stale air. Rows of brushes hung neatly along the back wall, each one wrapped in silk ribbon and tagged with a slip of red paper. They ranged from thick bamboo-handled tools meant for bold temple characters to delicate willow brushes, their hairs barely thicker than a breath, used to write ancestor names so precisely that not even a ghost could mistake them. Mr. Feng was crouched behind the counter, bent over a piece of parchment, squinting through his cracked spectacles. He didn't hear you enter. His brush moved in a slow, careful stroke, the kind only a man who feared his own mistakes could produce. You waited until he finished the line before speaking. "Is that for a temple registry or private altar?" you asked, keeping your voice low so it wouldn't startle him. He looked up with a slight jerk, his face pinched in that familiar mix of anxiety and reverence. "Private," he said after a beat. "Family in the Western District. Their father passed 3 nights ago. No fever, just didn't wake up. They brought a photo, even though I told them it wasn't necessary." You nodded slightly, eyes drifting to the brush he was holding. It was good quality. Horsehair, if you judged correctly. The ink was fresh too, not the watered kind that left pale, wandering strokes. Mr. Feng might be nervous, but he took his work seriously. That still meant something. "I heard," he added after a moment, voice softer now, "that someone painted over a wall charm in the lantern quarter, and that a man gave a white rooster to the stove god." You didn't answer. Not directly. Word spread fast in a city that wore its rituals like a second skin. "I also heard," he continued, "that you left a charm behind, at the house with the moss." Now you looked at him. Really looked. His hands were still shaking faintly, but not from fear. From hope. Or maybe something close to it. It had been a long time since someone looked at you not as a threat, but as a person who might still understand what these small acts of grace meant. "It wasn't official," you said finally. "I won't mention it in the report." He gave a tiny nod, then looked down at the parchment again. "Sometimes," he murmured, "I wonder if the ink remembers." You tilted your head. "Remembers what?" He smiled sadly, brushing his fingers over the drying characters. "The names, the prayers, the mistakes we make. All of it. I think maybe the brushes carry it. Or the walls. Or the wind." It was not an answer, not really, but you let it sit between you like warm tea, offering comfort just in its steam. You stepped around the counter and moved slowly through the shop, glancing at the rows of brushes. Most were as you remembered, but one caught your eye. Short carved handle, its silk wrapping undone and hanging like a ribbon in the rain. "This one," you said, pointing. "It's out of place." Mr. Feng came over quickly, his brow furrowed. "Ah, yes, I meant to restring it. But I think the last boy who touched it, he was new, he didn't ask permission from the altar before moving it." There it was again, a thread fraying. "Did anything happen?" you asked quietly. He hesitated, then gestured to a small painting on the wall. "That boy fell into the well behind his home 3 days later. Just a scraped leg, thank the gods, but still. His mother burned Vahijos sticks in a panic." You picked up the brush and rewrapped the silk, tying it in a slow, deliberate knot, the kind your grandmother taught you as a child. Mr. Feng watched in silence. When you finished, you set it back in its place and stepped back. "No records today," you said, "but perhaps tidy the shrine corner. The oil looks old, Tritos." Relief bloomed on his face like spring after frost. "Of course, immediately." You nodded and turned toward the door. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. The air smelled clean again. Not fresh exactly, but familiar, like parchment warmed by candlelight. As you stepped back into the open street, and the wind brushed lightly against your face, and for the first time in days it felt like something was watching again. Not in fear, not in anger, but maybe, just maybe, with memory. As you walked away from the brushmaker's shop, the city unfolded before you with a softness it hadn't shown all morning. The tension that had clung to your shoulders since dawn loosened its grip, if only slightly. The street lanterns swayed lazily above the eaves, their tassels curling with the damp air, and in the distance someone beat dough on a wooden board with a rhythm so even it could have been mistaken for music. The water in the gutter rippled around old leaves and bits of prayer paper, fragments from last month's temple rituals that had broken free of the past and gone floating into the present. You passed a vendor who had just opened his basket of roasted chestnuts. The steam rose up into the grey afternoon like incense that had forgotten its purpose. He didn't call out to you. No one ever did. But he offered a small bow, not the kind meant for officials, but one of quiet recognition. You nodded back, more out of habit than warmth, and carried on down a lane where the trees hung heavy with spring's slow promise. There was still one stop left. You hadn't told yourself this morning that you'd go there. In fact, you'd promised yourself you wouldn't. But the thought had trailed behind you all day, weaving in and out of your errands like a thread you couldn't quite shake. It was the shrine near the broken bell tower, the one at the edge of the burned district where no one lived anymore. Officially, it had been condemned years ago, the site marked off with ropes and warning signs and the kind of silent scorn that cities reserve for things they'd rather forget. But unofficially, people still went. Old women with grey braids tucked into scarves, teenagers testing the edge of belief with jittery offerings, mothers carrying bundles of garlic and prayer slips, all pretending not to be seen. You arrived there late in the afternoon. The sun hadn't shown itself all day, but now it tried to peek through the thinning clouds, its light fractured and dull. The old shrine stood hunched at the end of a wee, cracked stone path, its roof broken in one corner, tiles scattered across the yard like the shells of a long-forgotten feast. The air here was different. Not cold, not warm, just hollow. You felt it in your bones, in the way your feet paused without meaning to, in the way even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The shrine door hung ajar, not from neglect, but from refusal. No one closed it anymore. It had become a place that welcomed everything, including the things that ought not to enter. You stepped through slowly, the wooden floor creaking beneath your soles. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burnt oil and rotting wood. The main altar still stood, remarkably intact, though covered now in a thin film of dust and silence. You didn't light incense. There was none to light. Instead, you approached the offering plate. On it sat a single folded note, browned and brittle with time. You didn't touch it. You didn't need to. These kinds of notes were left by people who had nothing else to give. No chickens, no fruit, no paper money, only words. Please inked onto borrowed scraps. You recognised the handwriting style, old school, rural. It likely belonged to someone who had been taught by candlelight in a village classroom, someone who had written their pain in the only language they trusted to be heard. Outside, a soft rustling began, like wind through thin curtains, except there were no curtains here. You turned slowly and saw that a handful of ashes had been swept in by the breeze, not from any fire, but from the city itself. It happened sometimes. Loose ash carried by the wind, finding its way into forgotten places. The remnants of burnt offerings or household charms disposed of improperly. You watched as the grey dust gathered near the altar, dancing slightly before settling at your feet. And then, in that stillness, you did something you hadn't done in months. You whispered a prayer, not loudly, not for anyone to hear, just a few words, barely formed. A call without a name. A moment later you pulled out the small bundle in your sash, the petition slip from the broken shrine, the covered charm from the wall, and the paper from the scarred man's basin, and laid them gently on the edge of the altar. You didn't know if it meant anything. You weren't even sure what you believed anymore, but something inside you needed the act. It wasn't about the rules, it was about memory, about the part of your duty that no scroll or decree could ever describe. You stepped back and let the wind do what it wanted. It picked up the edge of the paper gently, as if unsure whether to take it. Then it dropped again, quiet. And for that moment, nothing moved. No bells, no voices, no questions, just the hush of a city remembering how to breathe. When you turned to leave, you didn't feel watched. You felt accompanied. The walk back from the old shrine took longer than it should have. Your pace had slowed, not from weariness of the legs, but from a heaviness deeper in the chest, as if your ribs were lined with wet cloth. The city was beginning its shift into evening. It did so gently, in increments so subtle that one could miss the moment day became something else entirely. Shadows crept down walls in long ribbons. Shopkeepers lowered their awnings and counted their coins with fingers blackened by the ink and smoke, and the lanterns began to appear. They came in bursts, flickering to life beneath lintels, outside courtyards, above stalls that would soon sell night dumplings and sesame cakes. Each lantern bore a character or symbol, luck, longevity, protection, and they swayed in the thickening breeze like old promises. You watched them light one by one as you passed, their paper skins glowing with that familiar orange hush. It was a ritual like any other, mostly unspoken but followed nonetheless, like brushing your hair before a storm or knocking 3 times on the lintel when passing a funeral. Not everything had to be written down to be sacred. You stopped briefly at a crossroads where a young girl was trying to relight her family's lantern. The flame inside had gone out too early, snuffed by a gust of wind that didn't belong to the hour. She was crouched low, shielding it with her hands, her brows knitted with the kind of seriousness only children show when they think the world might hinge on a single task. Her father stood nearby, pretending not to watch too closely, arms crossed but legs restless. You knelt without a word and cupped your hands around hers, steadying the flintstone she struggled with. Together you sparked the flame back to life. It caught slowly, then bloomed. She looked up at you, her face washed in lantern light, and whispered, "Does it count if someone helps?" You thought for a moment before answering. "Only If they want it to, she nodded, satisfied, and returned to tying the lantern string to the pole outside their door. Her father offered you a silent bow that felt heavier than any incense smoke you'd walked through today. You moved on, past the noodle vendors pulling long ropes of dough across flour-dusted boards, past the street storytellers whose voices now softened with the coming dark. Children gathered near one man whose tale involved a lost sword and a haunted teacup, but even their laughter held a note of reverence. Night in this city had always belonged to stories, just as day belonged to duty. The difference was that at night, no one expected them to be true. You reached your quarters as twilight finished settling its weight across the rooftops. Your home was modest, a 2-room courtyard house tucked behind the scribe hall, where the red walls faded from sun and the wooden beams sighed in the cold. You slipped off your sandals, dusted your feet, and stepped inside, greeted by the familiar scent of dried herbs and old parchment. A kettle still sat on the brazier, now long cooled, its lid askew as if it had grown tired of waiting. You lit the oil lamp with a practised flick and watched its light stretch across the room like a cat curling into an old spot. The silence felt different here. Not heavy, not haunted, just full. You moved to the low table by the back wall and unrolled a fresh sheet of parchment. The inkstone was already there, waiting. For a while you just sat, brush in hand, letting the bristles rest against your thumb. What would you write tonight? What could be recorded from a day that felt less like enforcement and more like quiet witnessing? You began slowly, your brush carving careful characters into the page. No names, no citations, just observations. A child asking about lanterns. A man burning household gods. A brush wrapped wrong and corrected not with punishment, but with hands. You wrote not because you had to, but because some things deserve to be remembered, even if only on a page no one else would read. When you finished, you set the parchment aside and reached into your robe. From its inner fold, you pulled out a single folded charm, one you hadn't given away. It was plain, just a blessing for peace and health, the kind any family might keep above their door. You unfolded it slowly and laid it on your palm. It looked smaller than it had this morning. Or maybe your hands were just more tired than usual. You walked outside and placed it on the edge of your window frame. The wind tugged at its corners but didn't lift it. It stayed balanced, like it understood. As the last of the lanterns bloomed across the city and the first stars dared to appear behind the veil of clouds, you stood there a while longer, listening. Not for voices, not for rules broken or rituals failed, but for something quieter. A heartbeat, maybe, buried deep beneath the bricks, beneath the habits and fears and endless rules. A rhythm older than law. That night, sleep did not come quickly, though the body was heavy and the mind worn smooth by the long, slow procession of duty. You lay on your mat beneath the paper window, the lamplight flickering once, then going still. Outside, the soft murmur of the city eased into its final breaths of the day. No dogs barked, no wheels clattered, even the insects kept to themselves, the rain having sent them into silence. Your thoughts wandered in the darkness, not in leaps or flutters, but in slow trailing threads, like smoke rising from a stick of incense. You saw the girl with the lantern again, her small hands trembling but determined. You saw the scarred man standing beside the ashes of his defiance. You saw Mr. Feng rewrapping the old brush, his eyes clouded with more than ink. And beyond all that, you felt the weight of forgotten offerings, of wall charms that had crumbled, of gods who were waiting, always waiting for someone to remember them. You drifted, not into sleep, but into a state just before it, that space where the world softens and dreams begin to tap at the edges of thought like gentle fingers. In that place you saw your mother, not clearly, just the shape of her, kneeling before a hearth, her hands folded around a bowl of rice and salt as she whispered to the stove god. Her lips moved in rhythm, the same prayer every morning. You never heard all the words as a child, but now the rhythm returned. Even in sleep, your mind reached for it, repeating it like a lullaby worn thin. You slept, finally, and in the sleep there was a dream, You were walking through the marketplace again, but it was empty. No stalls, no lanterns, only wind. And in every doorway a charm hung upside down, not by accident, but by some strange design. The sky was low and copper-coloured. The buildings leaned in as if they were listening to something you could not hear. And from somewhere nearby, the sound of sweeping, a slow dragging broom pulling debris inward toward nothing. You woke with a start. There was no sound, no broom, only the soft rustle of the wind against your paper screen and the faint chill of early morning sliding along your spine. You sat up slowly, brushing your hands over your face, not to chase away the dream, but to carry its shadow into the day. You had always believed dreams could mean something, not in the way the fortune men did, with charts and stones and maps of stars, but as echoes, as remnants of the spirit's attempts to speak in silence. You rose before the light came. That too was habit. The city was still half asleep, but already the air carried the scent of dawn, bamboo smoke, wet stone, and the first hints of steamed millet. You stepped into the courtyard, barefoot on the damp tile, and looked to the eastern wall where the charm you'd left the night before still clung stubbornly to the window frame. It had curled slightly at the corners, as if trying to listen. You stood there for a long moment, watching the sky lighten by fractions. No birds yet, no bells, just the hush of the world waking slowly, hesitantly. And in that moment you made a choice, though it didn't feel like one. You dressed without the sash, no badge, no emblem of office, just your robe, simple and grey. Today would not be a day for punishment or record. Today would be for seeing, for listening, for bearing witness to the city not as it should be, but as it was, worn at the edges, but still breathing. You stepped into the street as the first vendor struck flint to fire. The sound echoed down the lane like a signal. The morning had begun. Behind you, your home grew smaller with each step. Ahead, the city opened once more, ready to show you whatever it had hidden since yesterday. And above, just faintly, smoke curled from a rooftop where someone, somewhere, had remembered to light incense. The morning moved slowly through the city, not with the urgency of a market day, but with a quiet shuffle, as if even time had taken a breath. You walked without a fixed path, letting your feet choose corners and alleys that you usually passed over. Without your sash, without the official weight of the keeper's mark, the air around you felt different. People didn't part when you approached. They didn't lower their eyes or shift nervously. You were just another figure in the stream of the morning, a grey thread in the cloth of the day. It was in this muted anonymity that you found yourself near the South Terrace, where the old wind chime pavilion stood. It had once been the centre of the city's lesser festivals, those not grand enough for temple processions, but not small enough to be left to households alone. You remembered coming here as a child, hand wrapped around your father's fingers, eyes wide at the rows of coloured fans and strings of clattering chimes. Music made by wind and paper and hope. Today, the pavilion stood in silence. Its wooden frame was faded and missing a beam, its eaves chipped by time and storm. A few tattered streamers clung to the top rail, swaying softly in a breeze that carried no music. It wasn't decay that caught your attention, though. It was absence. This morning should have marked the day of quiet winds, a festival rarely remembered except by the elderly and the devout. On this day, paper birds were usually strung between houses, their wings dipped in sweet wine to appease the spirits said to ride the first summer breeze. Children would carry whistles carved from peachwood, and in the evening incense trails would be lit in long, curving spirals to guide the wind spirits back to the mountains. But there were no paper birds, no whistles, no incense. You looked around slowly. The street that fed into the pavilion still bore the name of the festival, etched into the stone arch above its entrance. Quiet Wind Lane. And yet today it held only the sound of a dog scratching at a gate and the occasional cough from a second-story window. There was no sign anyone remembered the date. At the far end of the lane, an old woman was setting up a stall of river pears. Her face was lined with more than time, and her hands moved with a rhythm that spoke of long repetition. You approached her slow, soft-footed, as one might approach a living relic. She looked up and gave you a long, squinting stare. "You're not wearing your badge," she said, voice like rice husks rubbing together. "Not today," you replied. "Do you remember the Wind Chime Festival?" She snorted softly, more air than sound. "Remember it? I used to run the sweet rice booth with my husband. He'd burn his fingers every year trying to shape the cakes while they were still hot." She looked down at her pears, arranging them with care. "But no one comes anymore. Last year I brought the rice cakes anyway. Sat by the pavilion from dawn to dusk. Sold two. One to a child who thought it was candy, the other to a bird." You said nothing for a moment. Just listened to the faint whir of the wind, how it tugged at the ribbons of her worn sun hat. "I could help," you offered quietly. "Find the children. Make a few paper birds." She gave you a look, not disbelief, not pity, just the gaze of someone who had heard too many good intentions drown in silence. "People don't forget because they're cruel," she said. "They forget because it's easier to chase new things than remember what once mattered." Still, she handed you a strip of red paper folded neatly in half. "Here, one of the last I have. If you're going to make a bird, use this." You took it with both hands and bowed your head slightly, not just out of gratitude, but out of apology. For her waiting alone last year, for the chimes that had lost their music, for all the forgotten things this city carried like quiet scars. You left her there among her pears, her face turned toward a sun that still had not shown itself. As you walked back up Quiet Wind Lane, you unfolded the paper. It was soft, well-aged, with faint creases where it had been pressed and stored for years. You didn't know how to make a paper bird, not properly, but maybe it didn't matter. Maybe the attempt was the offering. Maybe some spirits didn't need perfection, only memory. The wind picked up slightly, curling down the lane like a breath being drawn, and as it passed, one of the torn streamers on the pavilion fluttered free, spinning slowly in the air before it settled near your feet. You picked it up, tied it to the corner of the red paper, and whispered the first line of the festival chant. You weren't sure if you got the words right, but you said them anyway. You kept the paper bird folded in your sleeve as you moved north again, winding through the streets that curved like calligraphy strokes, soft and deliberate. There was something reassuring about the way the city wrapped around itself, not in straight lines, but in arcs and loops, like it was always on the verge of whispering a secret. The sky above had taken on that late morning glow that promises warmth without offering it. The clouds had scattered, but the air still held a stubborn chill, the kind that clung to old bones and stone walls. You found yourself walking toward the old southern canal, though you hadn't intended to. Your feet knew the way before your thoughts caught up. The canal was mostly dry this season, the water reduced to a trickling thread that glinted between rocks and discarded peach pits. But its banks were lined with willow trees, their long green arms trailing in the breeze like soft sighs. The willows here were ancient, older than most of the city's homes, planted during a dynasty whose name most children had forgotten. Some believed they were the homes of river spirits, and that if you sat long enough beneath their branches, you could hear the spirits murmur in your ear, not with words, but with memories. You took a seat on one of the stone benches tucked beneath the largest willow, a place where the leaves formed a kind of curtain against the world. The breeze made them whisper, a sound like fingers brushing, parchment, and for a long while you simply sat. The red paper bird rested in your palm, slightly creased now, its tail twitching in the breeze. As you watched the canal's sluggish water slide past the roots and stones, you saw a boy on the far side, maybe 10 years old, tugging at a string caught in the reeds. At first you thought it was a kite, but as he pulled it free you saw it was a faded charm, one of the larger ones, the kind used to bless whole buildings or bridges. It had likely drifted downstream from some forgotten offering. The boy studied it for a moment. Then, quite without ceremony, tied it to a stick and began poking it into the water like a fishing rod. He wasn't playing, he was repurposing, turning a forgotten ritual into a game without ever knowing what it had once meant. You stood slowly, crossed the narrow footbridge, and approached him. He looked up warily, then relaxed when he saw your robe lack the sash. You squatted beside him and nodded at the charm. "Do you know what that is?" you asked. He shook his head. "Just paper." "Used to be for blessings," you said gently. People would hang them to protect their homes, their families, sometimes even to protect travellers. He gave a half smile, then poked the stick at a passing clump of moss. "Guess it didn't work." You looked at the charm again, its edges water-warped, the ink still visible in places, though smudged beyond legibility. "Maybe it did," you said, "just not in the way we always expect." He glanced at you, eyes squinting in that way children do when they're not sure if you're teasing. "Can I keep it?" "If you want," you said. "Or you can give it to the tree." He looked at the willow. "What does the tree want with papers?" You smiled. "Maybe the same thing you do. To be remembered." He didn't answer, but after a moment he rose and tied the charm to one of the low-hanging branches. It fluttered there, caught between leaf and breeze. Not sacred, perhaps, but not forgotten either. You left him there, walking back beneath the willow curtain, your own bird still folded in your palm. The city's hum returned slowly as you left the canal behind. The soft splash of a bucket, the rustle of rice sacks, the bell of a tofu vendor trundling past with a squeaking wheel. And as you walked, you whispered to yourself, barely audible, not a prayer, not quite a wish. Just the words of an old song your grandmother once sang as she folded dumplings on festival nights. May the wind carry what we forget. May the roots remember what we lose. May the silence still be listening. The soft clatter of your footsteps echoed faintly as you made your way through the inner lanes, now lit by a gentler sun and dotted with people going about their quiet labours. There was a stillness to the day, not of inaction but of deep rhythm, the kind that settles into the bones of a city that has seen too much to rush anymore. Children ran, barefoot past corners lined with chipped statues, their laughter threading through open windows where grandmothers muttered over pickled greens and tea leaves. You passed a monk sweeping petals from temple steps, his straw broom whispering along the stone as if it too had prayers to repeat. This was the kind of moment that often passed unnoticed, the kind that disappeared into the folds of memory without ceremony. And yet here it was, shining quietly like a forgotten coin in the dust. You hadn't intended to visit the courtyard near the Bellmaker's Square, but your feet led you there as if pulled by some invisible thread. It was a place once known for its scholar gatherings, where poets and philosophers met under lanterns to debate the nature of duty and the placement of commas. Now it stood mostly empty, its stone benches lined with moss, the old vine-covered wall cracked just enough to let slivers of sunlight pour through in jagged patterns. You stepped through the half-open gate and were met with a sudden hush, as though the courtyard had been waiting for someone to remember it. There was something peculiar about the silence here. It wasn't oppressive, but neither was it welcoming. It had the weight of stories never spoken aloud. You walked to the centre, where a half-buried brazier once used for incense still lingered, cold and rusted. A few brittle sticks lay scattered beside it, their ends darkened as if burned long ago and never replaced. You bent and brushed the dirt away from the basin, your fingers tracing the rim where offerings used to sit, where handwritten verses once curled under flame. The scent was gone, of course. Only the shape of memory remained. It was then that you heard it. Not a voice, not quite, just the soft brushing of fabric, the almost imperceptible shift of air behind you. You turned slowly and found an old man sitting beneath the awning of a withered cherry tree. He must have been there when you arrived, motionless, blending into the scenery like a forgotten piece of furniture. His robe was patched but clean, the kind worn by retired scribes or monks who had taken to solitary life. His eyes were clouded but not blind, and when he looked at you, it was not with curiosity but recognition. "You're the one who walks with the forgotten," he said, his voice like cracked porcelain. You didn't answer right away. The phrase clung to the inside of your mind like smoke in a low ceiling. "I only follow where the rules lead," you replied carefully. He smiled without showing teeth. "And where have the rules led you today?" You glanced around the courtyard, taking in its fading elegance, its stubborn grace. "Here, apparently." He nodded slowly, as though that answer satisfied some question deeper than the one he had asked. "This place once sang," he said, "not with music, but with thoughts, the kind that lived only a moment, then vanished. You could hear them between the clink of teacups and the scratch of brush on scroll." You moved to the bench opposite him and sat, not because you were invited, but because you didn't want to speak standing up. Some conversations asked for patience. "Why did they stop coming?" you asked. "They didn't," he said. "They just stopped listening. It is not the gathering that creates meaning. It's the space between words, the pauses no one waits for any more." You let his words sit. He spoke like a man who had watched too many days melt into one another, who had survived long enough to forget why he started watching in the first place. "I found a boy today," you said after a while. "Fishing with a charm. Didn't know what it meant, didn't care. He tied it to a tree when I told him." The old man chuckled. "That's more than most do." "He thought it was just paper," you added. "All things are just something to someone," he replied. "A scroll is just a reed. A bell is just metal. A charm is just ink. Until we give it weight." You reached into your sleeve and withdrew the folded bird, the red paper now soft with the warmth of your body. You held it up and he looked at it with quiet reverence. "That," he whispered, "is a memory you haven't named yet." You placed it on the stone between you where the sunlight traced half its wing. For a long time neither of you moved. The wind rustled the cherry tree, sending a handful of petals, or perhaps just dust, drifting into the space between you. When you finally rose, the old man closed his eyes as though the conversation had tired him. You didn't say goodbye. It didn't feel right. Instead, you left the courtyard the way you had come, your steps slower now, as if trying not to disturb the stories asleep in the cracks. And behind you, the bird stayed, its red wings catching the light. By the time you left the courtyard, the city had grown warmer, its stone walls breathing with the heat of noon. The streets bustled now with midday chores, the stillness of early morning replaced with the hum of trade and talk. Vendors cried out over the din, ladling soups into clay bowls and flipping steam buns with a practiced rhythm. A man pushed a cart of bamboo brushes down the street, his wheels creaking with each turn, and somewhere not far off someone struck a metal bell to signal the arrival of fresh tofu. It was a comforting chaos, not loud but alive, the kind that reminded you the city was still working, still churning forward in its own complicated dance. You ducked under an awning outside a steamed bread shop, the scent of warm flour and sesame filling the air. The shop was tucked between a tea merchant and an old shrine, its exterior unremarkable but always busy. You'd passed it many times in uniform, never stopping for more than a nod to the owner, a woman with quick hands and a habit of folding her apron over her knees even when standing. Today, she saw you without your sash and tilted her head in mild surprise. "No rounds today?" she asked, wiping flour from her palms onto her sleeves. You offered a small smile. "A different kind of work." She gave a half laugh, not mocking, just weary. "Aren't they all the same in the end?" Before you could reply, a boy no older than 9 appeared at her elbow. He was thin, his tunic patched and unevenly dyed, and his hands were stained with ink, not from writing, but from handling paper that had been soaked and dried again. He held something in his hands, something crumpled and wrapped in old silk. The woman nudged him forward gently. "This is my nephew," she said. "His parents left him with me 2 springs ago. He's quiet. but he wanted to speak to someone about, well, show him. The boy stepped forward and unwrapped the bundle slowly, layer by layer. Inside was a thin wooden tablet, no longer than your forearm, the kind used for family blessings or death records. Its edges were worn and the inscription was barely legible, having been smeared by the water and years of being handled without care. What was still visible, however, was the faint outline of a dragonfly etched into the wood, just above the final character. You looked at the boy. Where did you get this? He didn't speak, just pointed towards the drains behind the shop where runoff from the upper alleys flowed in narrow streams, carving little trenches into the earth. The woman sighed. He found it while digging for scrap wood, she said. Didn't want to throw it away. Said it gave him a strange feeling when he touched it. You took the tablet gently and turned it over in your hands. It had been part of a household altar once, probably from a family that could no longer afford to keep such things. The dragonfly symbol, faint as it was, had once meant something important: protection in transformation, movement between worlds. You remembered your grandmother whispering to them during the festivals, leaving bits of honey and rice near the window in hopes of attracting their blessings. He keeps it under his pillow, the woman said softly, and he won't sleep without it. The boy looked down then, his small shoulders tense, as if ashamed to need something that had been tossed away by someone else. You crouched beside him and ran your thumb along the carved line of the dragonfly. You were right to keep it, you said. Even broken things remember where they came from. He nodded once, just barely. You wrapped the tablet back in the silk and handed it to him. Take it to the little shrine near the Windchime Pavilion. Leave it there with a piece of fruit if you have one, and light a matchstick if you don't have incense. He clutched the bundle to his chest, and for a moment you saw something flicker behind his eyes. Not belief, maybe, but something adjacent. Trust, perhaps, or hope in disguise. The woman handed you a small cloth packet without a word. Inside were 2 steamed buns, their tops still warm and marked with a red stamp of the bakery's emblem. You accepted it with a quiet nod and continued on your way, stepping into the narrow corridor between the shrine and the shop, where the breeze funneled through and lifted your sleeves like the touch of a curious spirit. As you walked, the boy's quiet presence stayed with you, like a thread trailing gently behind. You wondered how many other children had found forgotten relics beneath floorboards, in alleys, or drifting along canal banks. How many had felt the weight of something they couldn't name but didn't want to lose? You didn't have an answer, but you did have a sense that the city, however old and tired, still had places where meaning clung like moss to stone, and sometimes it only needed a small hand to carry it back into the light. By the time you reached the city's northeast quarter, the sun had begun its long lean toward the west, casting the alleyways in slanted light and gilding, even the dust in the air with a kind of sleepy glow. The steamed buns, now only faintly warm, sat in your pocket wrapped in soft cloth, their scent teasing against your steps. It had been hours since you last ate, but hunger was still a distant companion, content to walk beside you rather than beg attention. The encounter with the boy lingered like the aftertaste of a strong tea, subtle but unmistakable. He had not spoken a word, but he'd carried more reverence in his silence than most officials did in their proclamations. This part of the city was quieter, less traversed during the day. Here the streets narrowed, bordered by high walls of courtyards long closed to strangers. These were the homes of retired officials, once scholars, widowed aunts, and all those whose names used to carry weight but now lived in the soft edge of memory. The roads twisted here, not by design, but because the land beneath them had shifted over generations, subtly reshaping paths the way water carves stone. Every corner felt like a pause in a sentence too long, as if the city itself was gathering its thoughts. It was near a covered bridge where you first saw him, the man with the red umbrella. At first it seemed out of place, an umbrella when there was no rain, red when the day's palette had turned to golden brown. He stood near the bridge's edge, where the wooden rails met a post carved with lotus patterns, faded but still visible. He wasn't selling anything, nor was he begging or preaching or praying. He simply stood, one hand resting on the umbrella's lacquered handle, the other holding something small and square, a mirror perhaps, or a compact tablet. His robe was unassuming, deep blue with edges just beginning to fray, the kind worn by a craftsman of good fortune but no ambition. Curiosity carried your feet forward. You approached without announcing yourself, the way you might enter a room where someone was already deep in thought. The man turned slightly as you neared, and in the full light, you saw that his eyes were clouded with that milky veil that sometimes came with age, but they darted and tracked like a man who missed nothing. "You're the one from the shrine," he said without question. You stopped mid-step, not because he was wrong, but because you couldn't quite understand how he knew. "I passed through it this morning," you replied. "I've passed many places." He nodded slowly, still facing slightly away, as if listening to a sound only he could hear. But not all places remember being passed through. That one does. You weren't sure what to make of him. He didn't seem mad. His presence was too grounded, too deliberate for that, and there was a stillness to him, like a man standing not in a street, but at the centre of something unseen. "What are you doing here?" you asked, tilting your head toward the bridge. He lifted the red umbrella and pointed it upward, toward the roof of the covered crossing. "There's a bird," he said, "a very small one, nesting between the beams. It returns every year at this time, even when the wood was scorched during the fire, even when the merchants stopped coming. It still came, just..." You looked up, and after a moment you saw it. A finch, barely a thumb's length long, perched in a dip where two tiles had split. It looked at you briefly, then tucked its head back beneath its wing. "Why the umbrella?" you asked. "In case it rains," he said simply. "Even birds deserve small kindnesses." You stood beside him in silence for a time, watching the finch sleep, its breath so light it barely moved. People passed behind you without stopping, their eyes sliding over the two of you like water on wax. The world had little room for pauses like this, and yet here it was, open and waiting. The man finally turned toward you fully. In his other hand you now saw the object more clearly. It was neither a mirror nor a tablet, but a prayer board. Blank except for one tiny character etched into the centre. "Listen. I leave these in places where silence lives," he said. "Sometimes someone finds them, sometimes they don't." He handed it to you without ceremony. "Why me?" "Because today you're walking without armour." You took it, tracing the single character with your thumb. The wood was smooth, old, familiar. You didn't ask him his name. Some meetings weren't meant for names. They were meant to pass through you like wind, to leave you changed without ever knowing exactly how. He tipped his umbrella slightly and walked away toward the other end of the bridge, his pace unhurried, the red of the canopy glowing briefly before he disappeared into the dappled light of the alley beyond. You stood there a moment longer, then slipped the prayer board into your robe beside the folded bird and the softened bun. You didn't know what the day meant, not fully, but the city was telling you something, and for once you were trying to listen. Your feet carried you past the bridge, past the place where the red umbrella had last glowed like a flame, and down a sloping lane that narrowed with every step. The air here was cooler, shaded by the long beams and sagging eaves, where vines slipped between roof tiles and birds nested in the nooks of cracked wood. This part of the city was older still, the kind of old that no longer held itself upright with pride but leaned gently against time, like a tired uncle nodding off mid-conversation. It was here, between two leaning walls, that you found the tea house. You'd known it was near. The scent gave it away first, aged pu'er and roasted barley, mingled with the faint perfume of dried chrysanthemum. Not the kind of tea brewed for strangers, but for regulars, for people who didn't need to order because the cup was already waiting before they arrived. The doorway was low, the wooden sign overhead faded to near invisibility. If you didn't know to look for it, you'd walk right past, which you suspected was exactly how the owner liked it. You ducked inside and were met by a wash of warmth and dim light. The room was long and narrow, its walls lined with bamboo shelves stacked with jars and scrolls. A few low tables were scattered about, though most were empty. Only 3 others sat in the space. An elderly man tapping his cup rhythmically with his fingernail, a woman with white-streaked hair steeping herbs in her own clay pot, and a younger man in the far corner sketching a coin repeatedly onto parchment as if trying to remember its edges. Behind the counter, the tea master moved slowly, as if every gesture had been written into his bones long ago and simply needed remembering each morning. His robe was the soft brown of old parchment, and his beard was trimmed close to his chin, though his eyebrows seemed to have taken on the ambition to grow in place of his hair. He looked up as you entered and nodded, a small movement that meant everything and nothing. You took your usual seat by the window, a cushion more than a stool beside a bamboo screen that filtered the light into gentle lines. He brought the tea without asking. It was chrysanthemum today, floating yellow flowers curling in slow circles within the clay cup. You inhaled deeply, letting the warmth seep into your palms as you cradled it. The steam curled into the shape of something nameless and drifted toward the ceiling where it vanished into shadow. For a long while you didn't speak. No one did. The tea house had that kind of magic about it. It allowed people to sit with their thoughts without obligation. The city outside could boil with voices, wheels, traders, and laws, but inside this room there was only the gentle clink of pottery and the rustle of someone adjusting a scroll. The tea master returned and sat across from you without ceremony. He poured himself a cup from the same pot and let the silence settle comfortably between you. Then, without looking directly at you, he asked, "You're not wearing your burden today." You looked down at your plain robe. "No," you said. "I wanted to see the city without it." "And what did it show you?" he asked, taking a slow sip. "Children repurposing blessings, shrines half forgotten, men with red umbrellas watching finches, a city remembering itself in fragments." He smiled into his tea. "Sounds like a day well spent." You studied the pattern in the liquid before you. Why does it matter so much that people forget? Why do I care if a wall charm fades or if a boy fishes with a ruined prayer? The tea master exhaled through his nose, a sound that was not quite a sigh. Because those things were never just things, they were touchstones, anchors. When people stop believing in the small rituals, they stop seeing the invisible threads that tie them to each other. You feel the loss not because the charm fades, but because the silence it leaves behind echoes too loudly. You nodded slowly, your fingers tightening slightly around the cup. "I think I was taught to enforce rules, not preserve echoes." "But rules without memory," he said gently, "are just walls without doors." You let the words hang there, like steam between 2 breaths. Then from your robe you pulled the small prayer board, the one the man with the red umbrella had given you, and placed it on the table. The tea master looked at it for a long time. "Listen," he murmured, reading the single character. "Not obey, not command, just listen." You added the folded red paper bird beside it. "These are what I've gathered today," you said. "I don't know what to do with them." The tea master looked at both offerings, then at you. "Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything. You don't have to make meaning of them. Just don't throw them away, not yet." You sat in silence after that, letting the tea grow cooler, the sky outside dimming into that uncertain shade between afternoon and dusk. The other guests filtered out one by one, until only you and the tea master remained. He poured the last of the pot into your cup and rose. "When the city forgets, it leaves clues for those who still listen," he said, turning toward the back room. "Keep listening. You'll know what to do." And then he was gone, the door clicking softly behind him, leaving you alone with your cup, your thoughts, and the gentle hush of a room that had seen more memories than most temples. When you finally stepped out of the tea house, the city had softened again. Shadows pooling in corners and a kind of golden hush settling over the rooftops. The sun, now lower in the sky, touched every surface with the gentle finality of a closing fan. You walked slowly, your steps quiet on the stone as if even your feet recognised the shift in rhythm. The tea still lingered on your tongue, faintly floral, like a whisper that hadn't quite left the room with you. You passed along the eastern wall of a bakery just shuttering its windows for the day, the scent of red bean paste drifting lazily through the air, mingling with the faint bite of ash from a nearby brazier. In your pocket, the prayer board tapped softly against your side with every step, and the folded bird pressed against it like two memories keeping each other company. You didn't know what you were carrying anymore, only that it had grown heavier by the hour, not in weight but in meaning. The rules you used to carry felt lighter by comparison, their edges sharper but less deep. This was different. This was slower, messier, more human. You found yourself approaching the calligraphy hall. It stood in a quiet pocket between the scribe quarter and the narrow rice shop alleys, its tiled roof low and mottled with moss. The front door was wide open, a silent invitation. No bells marked the entrance, no guards, just a worn stone step and a wooden sign with the faded symbol for transcription. You'd spent many evenings here during your early years in the city, copying petitions and temple records under dim lanterns. Your fingers stained black with ink and your back bent for hours. It wasn't a place for worship, but it held a kind of reverence, a deep respect for the shape of thought when placed on paper. Inside, the hall smelled of ink and cedar and time. Scrolls lined the walls in wooden cubbies, tied with simple twine and marked with faded brush strokes. Several students sat at long tables in silence, their brushes scratching rhythmically against parchment, each stroke deliberate and unhurried. At the far end of the hall sat the master scribe, a lean man with a cloud of white hair gathered into a knot behind his head. He didn't look up when you entered, but you knew he had registered you. He always did. His ears were sharper than his eyes. You approached him and bowed slightly. "I'm not here for a commission," you said softly. He dipped his brush once, finished the line he was writing, then set it gently aside. "Then you're here for what the paper does not ask." You reached into your robe and pulled out the prayer board. He took it in both hands and studied the single character, nodding once. "There was a time," he said, "when messages with only one word were considered the most sacred, because they trusted the reader to fill the silence." He set the board down gently and gestured for you to sit. You did. Across the table lay a dozen unfinished scrolls, their beginnings sketched in faint ink, waiting for names or endings, or sometimes just the courage to be continued. He unrolled one and handed you a brush. "No instructions?" you asked. "No need," he replied. "Write what you won't remember tomorrow. That's the only rule." You dipped the brush into the ink and let it hover over the page. At first your hand hesitated, unsure if the words would come, unsure even what the words should be. But the ink was patient. It waited, and slowly your hand began to move. You didn't write names. You didn't write events. You wrote impressions. The sound of the girl's flint striking outside her home. The look in the eyes of the boy who fished for forgotten blessings. The weight of silence in the tea house, thick enough to cup in your hands. You wrote the colour of the red umbrella and the hollow breath of wind through an old shrine door. You wrote what it felt like to stand in a city that had forgotten its reasons, but still remembered how to wait. When you finished, the master scribe took the parchment, read it once, then folded it carefully and slid it into an unlabelled shelf. "No need to keep it?" you asked. He smiled, the corners of his mouth turning upward, with the slow amusement of someone who had seen lifetimes pass through ink. "It's already kept," he said. You wrote it. Outside, the bells of the upper temple began to ring, 6 low tones, slow and deliberate, signalling the approach of dusk. You stood, bowed again, and turned to leave. As you walked out, one of the students handed you a fresh scroll, rolled and tied with black string. He didn't ask what it was. Some gifts were better unopened until needed. The wind picked up as you stepped back into the street, carrying with it the scent of evening fires and the faint murmur of a city settling into itself. You had written the day down, let it bleed through the fibres of parchment and memory. Now was time to walk into what remained of the night. The temple bells faded behind you as you stepped into the corridor of dusk, where colours no longer shouted but murmured instead. The city had taken on that half-lit tone now, everything dipped in warm grey, as if painted with the wash of memory rather than fresh colour. Candles had begun to flicker in windows, their glow soft and uncertain. A few people had started setting out evening offerings, bowls of rice, tiny sticks of incense, sweet buns, or left on windowsills for ancestors or passing spirits. You walked with your hands clasped behind you, the scroll tucked beneath your arm and the weight of the day settling deep into your ribs. It was a comfortable weight, the kind that reminds you've lived the day properly, not in grand gestures, but in slow, thoughtful motion. As you turned into the old market square, a curious stillness stopped you. This place, by custom, should have been blooming with noise and colour. Today, this was the square where the Minor Lantern Festival should have begun, the lesser celebration that followed the Full Moon Festival by a week. It was not grand. No imperial drums, no silk processions, just little lanterns in the shapes of fish and rabbits, children with bells tied to their sleeves and old songs hummed out of habit rather than performance. You remembered coming here once, long ago, to buy a turtle-shaped lantern made of rice paper and bamboo. You remembered how its belly had glowed with golden fire as you carried it home, in both hands, afraid even to breathe too hard in case the light went out. Now the square stood almost empty. The stalls were still there, their roofs laced with old string lights that hadn't been lit. Poles meant to hold lanterns leaned against the stone walls in piles, unclaimed and unused. A few figures moved through the square, not with purpose, but with the distracted shuffle of people unsure if they'd come to the right place or forgotten something along the way. An old vendor sat behind a stall that held nothing but a single unlit lantern shaped like a carp. He didn't call out. He just sat, his eyes on the stone beneath his feet as if watching the outlines of shadows for some forgotten cue. You crossed the square slowly, your steps quiet against the stones, and approached him. "It was supposed to be today," you said gently, not as a question, but as a confirmation of what both of you knew. He looked up, his face drawn but not bitter. People used to come early, tie bells to the stall corners, children would spill tea, grandmothers would argue over whose lantern had better symmetry. He chuckled, but it was a sound that barely made it past his throat. This year, no one came. You reached into your robe and brought out the folded red paper bird. It felt fitting somehow. You placed it gently on his table beside the unlit carp. "They still remember," you said. "Somewhere inside. They just don't know what to do with the memory." The vendor looked at the bird as if it had spoken to him. "Maybe they're waiting for someone else to start. Maybe they're afraid it won't matter." He looked up then, his eyes clearer than before. "But it does." You nodded and glanced around the square. The lantern poles stood like fallen soldiers, waiting to be lifted. You stepped over to one, picked it up, and leaned it against the corner of his stall. Then another, and another. You tied one with the thin rope still hanging from a nearby post. Your fingers worked slowly, clumsily at first, until the rhythm returned. The vendor watched you, then stood. Without speaking, he lit a small oil lamp and placed it in the centre of the carp. It flickered to life, casting a faint red shimmer on the worn wood of his table. And somehow that was enough. One of the passers-by, a young mother with her child slung across her back, paused. The child pointed, tugged at her robe. She approached the stall and spoke softly to the vendor. A few coins changed hands. She left with the glowing carp, its light swaying gently in rhythm with her steps. You didn't stay to see if more people came. It didn't matter if they did. The point was never the crowd, it was the act, the remembering. The simple act of lighting one lantern and lifting one pole, like a breath drawn in a forgotten song. like a footstep in a path that had once been sacred. You moved on, the night folding softly around you. From somewhere deeper in the city, music began to drift through the streets, a lone flute playing an old melody, its notes bending with the wind. You followed it for a while, not with urgency, but with the quiet trust that it would lead you somewhere you needed to be. And as you walked, behind you, the glow of the first lantern reflected faintly off the stones, dancing like a story just beginning to wake. The music led you like a thread pulled gently through cloth, winding you into the heart of the city's older districts where the stones beneath your feet bore the impressions of thousands of unspoken prayers and footfalls layered, one upon another, like silken folds. The sound of the flute wove in and out of earshot, not steady but teasing, rising only to dip behind walls and flutter across rooftops like a bird unsure of whether to land. It was not a joyful tune, nor mournful either. It lived in that in-between space where longing hums just beneath peace, and hope wears the clothes of memory. You passed through a narrow tunnel beneath an old ceremonial gate where moss had crept up the carvings and softened their once sharp lines. A small boy darted past you carrying a lantern shaped like a rabbit, laughing to himself as if chasing some private joke. No adults followed, just that brief flicker of joy bounding ahead, a sign that perhaps the old rhythms were stirring again. You watched him vanish down an alley and then turned, drawn once more by the pull of the music. The source revealed itself slowly, as if reluctant to be known. Tucked into the bend of a descending street that led toward the lower ponds sat an ancient stairwell. 20 stone steps carved into the earth, each one dipped slightly in the middle from generations of souls wearing them down. And there, near the bottom, with his back pressed against the wall and his knees drawn close, sat the flute player. He was old but not frail. His robes were loose and the colour of river clay, and his feet were bare, blackened at the heels but firm against the cool stone. The flute itself was nothing fancy, just smooth bamboo, worn from long handling. As you approached, he did not look up or pause in his playing. The tune shifted slightly to accommodate your arrival, a grace note here, a slower beat there, as though your presence had entered the composition without disrupting it. You sat quietly a few steps above him, letting the music speak first. Around you the steps were lined with tiny offerings, coins, dried flowers, strips of cloth tied in knots, and a few half-burned incense sticks stuck upright in the cracks between the stones. None were extravagant. All were deliberate. He finished the song on a note that drifted upward and vanished like breath into winter air. Then he lowered the flute and turned his head just enough to see you from the corner of one eye. "Did you bring anything worth hearing?" he asked. His voice was low, not gravelly, but softened with time. "I brought the day," you said simply, and a bird folded from red. "Paper?" He smiled faintly. "Then that's more than most." You removed the red bird again, setting it gently beside you on the step. The flute player looked at it with a gaze that lingered. "There was once a belief," he said, "that red birds carried messages between the living and the dead. Not grand ones, just everyday things, a missed laugh, a forgotten apology, a thank you never spoken." You thought of the boy with the charm, the old woman with her pears, the man with the red umbrella, the empty festival square, all of them with messages they had never been asked to deliver, lives folded quietly beneath the weight of what was unspoken. "Do people still believe that?" you asked. He shook his head, but not with bitterness. They stopped asking questions like that. You looked down the steps to where the path curved into the ponds, the water barely visible in the fading light. A soft mist had begun to rise, brushing the edges of the stones like a sigh. Somewhere far off a bell rang once, deep and solitary. "Why play here?" you asked. He reached for a cloth bag beside him, pulling from it a small rectangular object wrapped in faded silk. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing a slate of carved wood, much like the one the boy had carried, but this one bore the mark of the wind, etched in deliberate lines that arced like currents over the surface. "This place listens," he said, "even when no one else Some does. You nodded, understanding more than agreeing. You removed the prayer board from your robe and placed it beside the bird. The word listen sat quietly between the objects, as if it had been waiting for the company. He looked at the board, then at you. You've been gathering. I didn't mean to. You don't have to mean something for it to matter. You both sat for a long time, saying nothing more. The mist rose higher, curling around your legs, soft and cool. A second lantern passed overhead, carried by a girl whispering to her own reflection in its glass. The flute player watched her disappear into the shadows, then raised his instrument again. "Stay a while," he said. "Let the city hum itself to sleep." And you did. You let the music carry you into the soft edges of evening. The red bird nestled close, the word listen, glowing faintly in the last of the light. The notes of the flute still drifted behind you, ghostly and trailing like a lullaby caught in the folds of your robe as you climbed the steps back toward the winding paths of the upper quarter. Night had come gently with no grand fanfare. Lamps flickered behind paper windows, their light hazy like the breath of sleeping gods, and above the stars blinked into place one by one, as if remembering their cue from an old script. You walked more slowly now, not out of fatigue, but because each turn and narrow corridor felt suddenly significant, as if the very bricks under your sandals remembered your passing. The day had been dense with quiet meanings. Your hands no longer felt empty. You followed instinct rather than route, your feet knowing where to turn even before your thoughts caught up, until you stood before a door you hadn't opened in years. It was tucked behind the city's East Records Hall, through a side entrance most people forgot existed. The stone lintel above the door was chipped in a familiar way, and the iron handle bore the smooth polish of long use. You paused before touching it, not out of hesitation, but out of respect. This was the door to the archivist's room. You pushed gently, and the door gave way with a soft sigh, revealing a narrow chamber lit by the amber glow of a single oil lamp set low on the floor. The room was filled with scrolls, stacked, shelved, tied in bundles or laid flat beneath glass panels. The scent of aged paper mingled with the must of old wood and faint traces of camphor. It was not a place many entered anymore, not since the records had begun their slow migration to the new building with polished floors and inkless ledgers. But this room, this one, still lived. It breathed with the weight of memory. Behind a low desk sat the archivist. She was as you remembered her, though her hair had turned fully silver and her back curved more than before. Her eyes, however, remained sharp, piercing, in the way only those who have spent a lifetime reading forgotten truths can manage. She looked up from her scroll without surprise, as though you had been expected not today but eventually. "Have you come to deposit or retrieve?" she asked, her voice cool, but not unkind. You stepped inside, closing the door softly behind you. "I'm not sure." She set down her brush and gestured toward a stool beside her. You sat, letting your eyes wander the shelves, the labels inked in neat calligraphy, flood logs, market permits, border oaths, forgotten gods. That last one made you smile faintly. You removed the items one by one, first the folded red bird, now slightly worn at the edges, then the prayer board, the single word listen still glowing faintly in the lamplight, and finally the scroll the student had given you, still tied with its black string. The archivist watched without comment. "These aren't records," you said softly. "Not official ones." "No," she replied, "but they are memories, and memory often chooses its own archivist." She reached out, her fingers brushing over the surface of the board. "This one," she murmured, "belongs here." She took it gently and placed it in a drawer beside her desk, where you could see other objects, an inkstone cracked in two, a dried lotus blossom sealed in wax, a spoon etched with a poem so tiny it could barely be read. "What about the bird?" you asked. She tilted her head. "That's not for the archive, that's for you." You looked down at it, here, feeling its weight shift slightly in your palm. "It doesn't mean anything," you said. It means exactly what you carried it for, she replied. The shape of care, the act of noticing. You untied the scroll next, slowly, letting it unravel across the desk. The ink was fresh, but the words it bore were older than the city itself. Not in language, but in spirit. It was a record of your day, but written in impressions rather than events. A map of sensations, sounds, unspoken conversations, small kindnesses folded between unremarkable moments. She read a portion silently, then rolled it back up and placed it in a bamboo tube marked unsorted. That one, she said. We'll revisit later. Some things need time to become history. You looked around the room again, your gaze drifting from shelf to shelf. Why keep it all, you asked? Why hold what no one asks to see? The archivist smiled, her expression softer now. Because cities forget, she said, and people leave, but memory doesn't die, it just waits. You nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. You rose to leave, taking the red bird with you. As you reached the door, the archivist spoke once more, her voice low and distant. Next time, she said, bring something broken. Those are the records that speak the loudest. You stepped back into the night, the door clicking shut behind you, the scent of old paper still lingering in your clothes. Above you, the stars blinked again, brighter now, and in your hand the red bird stirred faintly in the breeze, its wings not fluttering but remembering. You followed the lamplit path back toward the western slope of the city, the quiet hour deepening with each step. The stone beneath your feet was cool now, holding the touch of the evening air as it settled into the cracks. Above, the moon had fully risen, a soft disk resting in the clouds like a pale coin dropped in a velvet purse. It was nearly full, its light filtered through 1,000 ancient rooftops, catching on the edges of weathered tiles and the smooth curve of worn balconies. You took a different turn this time, instinct leading you again, until you came upon a walled garden you hadn't seen in years. The plum tree stood at its centre, just as you remembered it, its dark limbs reaching toward the night in careful arcs. In spring it would have been crowned with blossoms, but now it bore only leaves that rustled gently in the evening breeze. You stepped through the open gate, brushing aside the low-hanging vines that curled around the entrance, and walked into the stillness. There were no lanterns here, no bells or incense, only the soft chorus of insects and the gentle creak of the garden's old wooden bench. You sat beneath the tree, setting the red bird gently beside you on the bench, and tilted your head back to look through the branches. The stars blinked through the gaps like curious eyes. You didn't speak. There was no need. The city had said all it needed to say for one day, and so you let yourself breathe fully and deeply, in a moment that belonged to no one, and nothing but now. The quiet beneath the plum tree seeped into your skin like steam from a waiting bowl of broth, wrapping itself around your shoulders and slipping down your spine until even your breath moved slower. You weren't tired, not in the usual sense, but you felt the kind of stillness that only comes when a day has opened fully before you and asked you to see it. Really see it, not just pass through. You sat there a long while, your hands resting loosely on your knees. The red paper bird settled like a small sleeping companion beside you. Somewhere nearby a dog barked once, then fell silent, as though it too recognised the need to leave the night undisturbed. You became aware of the ink on your fingers then, faint but present. The brush from the archivist's desk had left its memory on your skin, and now you found yourself rubbing your thumb gently against your forefinger, feeling the slight grit of dried pigment. It reminded you of those long-ago days when your job had first begun, before your sash had lost its stiffness, and your gaze had become trained to catch only violations. Back then, ink stains had meant you were still learning, still wrestling with the language of law and tradition, still in awe of the weight a few words could carry. You hadn't thought about that in a long time. Now, sitting beneath this tree in this forgotten garden that smelled faintly of moss and sweet bark, the ink no longer felt like a mark of duty. It felt like a reminder but something inside you still remembered how to notice that maybe listening didn't need to be commanded, it just needed to be chosen. The garden stayed still, as though it too was holding its breath, listening for something that might come rustling through the leaves or tapping softly at the edge of the night. Your fingers, still faintly stained with ink, drifted toward the hem of your robe, where the black-threaded scroll lay tucked. You had nearly forgotten it amidst the weight of the day, but now its presence made itself known again, subtle but insistent, like a thought that refused to fade. With gentle care you untied the string and unrolled the parchment across your lap, the crisp sound of paper brushing against your knees and the whisper of old fibres parting under your hands. Inside the scroll was not a poem or a decree, nor even the impressions you expected to find. It was blank, entirely blank, save for one small square of paper tucked inside, folded once with deliberate precision. You unfolded it slowly and found a single character drawn with soft, practiced strokes. Kindle, not in the sense of setting fire, but the old meaning, the one rarely spoken now, the act of coaxing light where there is none, of urging warmth into being not through force but through patience. You turned the slip over and saw the faint trace of wax clinging to one corner, as if it had once been pressed beside a candle's flame. The word was not a command. It was an invitation. Something inside you stirred, something older than memory but quieter than resolve. You reached into your robe and drew out the small oil lamp you had been given long ago, the one you kept for no practical reason but could never bring yourself to part with. Tonight, beneath the plum tree's gentle hush, you lit it, and the flame answered. The flame caught with a quiet bloom, not sudden or hungry, but careful, almost shy. It leaned toward the wick, like a conversation leaning in close, then settled into a steady dance, casting its amber light over the small scroll on your lap and the edges of your sleeve. The garden's silence accepted the flame without protest. The leaves did not stir, and even the plum tree above seemed to lean slightly as though to witness. You watched the light as it flickered gently against the curve of the oil lamp, and for a moment you saw something there, not a shape exactly, but a suggestion. Like the breath of a face leaning just beyond the glass, the flame curved and moved in a way that felt almost purposeful, as though it was not just burning, but speaking. You didn't move. Instead, you leaned slightly forward, your hands resting on your knees again, eyes fixed on the soft heart of the fire. The word on the paper, Kindle, pulsed in your thoughts with each small flicker, and you realized how many things in this city still waited to be lit. Not with fire, but with presence, with someone willing to sit still, long enough for the spark to catch. The street festival that had never begun. The boy with his ink-stained fingers and dragonfly charm. The forgotten music echoing beneath stone steps. None of them were forgotten. Not really. They were just waiting for someone to notice again. The lamp crackled softly as though agreeing. A breeze passed through the garden then, light and slow, and the flame dipped once and returned, steady. You held its warmth in your gaze and let its message settle into you without needing to shape it into words. Some understanding did not require language. The candlelight swayed once more, soft as a sigh, before easing into stillness. You leaned back against the bench, your shoulders touching the curve of the wooden slats as the warmth of the flame continued to cast its quiet halo around your small corner of the world. The garden remained unchanged, yet everything felt different, as though the moment itself had become denser with meaning. You could feel the day pressing behind your eyes, not in exhaustion, but in fullness, like a book you had read slowly and savoured page by page. The word Kindle hovered in your chest, not burning, but glowing with the certainty of something rediscovered rather than learned. Above you, the plum tree rustled, its leaves shifting slightly against one another, and in the breeze that followed, a few dry petals fell, not white or pink, for this was not their season, but browned at the edges, thin as old parchment. One Sunday sauce. Them landed on the window ledge beside you. It looked like something that had waited there for a very long time, perfectly at home in the layer of fine dust that lined the wooden surface. You reach it over without thinking and brush the dust gently with your sleeve, revealing the grain of the wood beneath, a soft golden streak that caught the candle's light. And there, in the corner of the ledge, was a single character carved so finely you almost missed it. Return. You blinked once, unsure if you'd seen it correctly, but the carving held steady in the glow. You traced it gently with your finger. It had been there for years, perhaps carved by a visitor long gone, or maybe by a caretaker who once watched over the garden, before memory grew quiet. Either way, it was waiting, like the rest of this city. You left the garden with the oil lamp still burning gently in your hand, its glow protected behind the curved glass like a secret you hadn't yet decided to share. The red bird remained tucked close to your side, the paper now softened from touch but still holding its shape. You didn't know exactly where your feet were taking you now, but there was no urgency in deciding. The city, in its strange half-sleep, seemed to welcome your unhurried steps. Its alleys opened like old books, each corner offering a memory, a question, or sometimes just silence. You passed a closed apothecary with scrolls pasted to its walls, each one curling slightly at the edges with age. A low table sat outside, still bearing a chipped teacup and the stub of a brush, as if the owner had merely stepped out for a moment and forgotten to return. The lamp in your hand flickered as you passed, catching its reflection in the glass, and for a breath you saw yourself as a figure within the shop's window. Someone paused in time, moving through a city not entirely awake. You kept walking. Farther down, a small courtyard opened to your left. You remembered this place too. Once a widow had sold dumplings here on winter evenings, the steam rising in delicate clouds that had scented the entire lane with garlic and ginger. The stall was gone now, but the stone basin she used to wash her hands still sat in the corner, moss creeping up its rim. You stepped toward it and, without quite meaning to, dipped your fingers into the water. It was cold, not biting, just honest. The kind of cold that reminds you that you are still alive, still present, still able to feel. And then you continued. Not toward a shrine or hall, not to meet a stranger or record a ritual, just forward, into the hush that had folded itself around the city like a warm robe at the end of a long day. The night did not ask anything of you, and for the first time in what felt like seasons, neither did you. You were simply part of it, a listener walking softly through a place that had remembered how to speak. Your steps took you past the weaver's quarter, where the doors were all closed but the scent of dyed thread still clung to the air, faintly metallic and sweet like damp silk. The walls here leaned inwards as if they too were listening, and though there was no one on the streets, the city didn't feel empty. It felt occupied by memory, not the kind bound in scrolls or told aloud, but the quieter kind that waits in door frames and under windowsills. You passed one home with its shutters drawn halfway, and for the briefest second, you caught a flicker of movement behind the wooden slats, a hand maybe, or the glint of a watchful eye. But it vanished before you could be sure, and you moved on, the rhythm of your steps in time with the soft knock of your lamp's frame against your robes. Ahead, a soft glow lit the next bend. It wasn't firelight or lantern. It came from a brazier set at the base of a staircase that led into a house you didn't recognise. The door was opened slightly, and the steps were swept clean, as if in anticipation of someone's arrival. And laid out on the top step, very precisely, was a scroll, sealed with a black ribbon, and an imprint of a small inked bird. You hesitated. This was not yours, not left for you, and yet you felt the pull of it, like being handed a thread already tied to your sleeve. You stepped forward and knelt beside it. The brazier gave off the soft scent of pine, and something older, maybe sandalwood. You reached out but didn't touch it yet. There was a quietness to this place that felt sacred, not holy perhaps, but consecrated by intention. The air was thick with waiting. You stayed kneeling before the scroll for a while, your fingers hovering just above it, the heat from the brazier warming the skin on your hands. The air had grown even more still, the kind of stillness that doesn't press but waits, inviting you to meet it halfway. You could hear the night breathing now, in the sway of branches somewhere above, in the slow settling of the city's timber and stone, in the way your own chest rose and fell without hurry. The ribbon on the scroll was tied not in a knot but a loop easy to untwist, as if the one who placed it had meant for it to be opened not with suspicion but with gentleness. You lifted it slowly, the inked bird emblem brushing softly against your thumb. The paper was thick, the kind that held warmth once touched, and as you unrolled it, the ribbon slid off like a whisper. There was no salutation, no name, only a series of lines, brushstrokes drawn with a steady hand. They were not words, not in the way you had come to expect them. No sentences, no punctuation, just a quiet procession of marks that moved down the page like a melody written without notes, a language meant to be felt more than read. You didn't try to interpret it at first. Instead, you let your eyes trace each curve and inked turn, letting them settle into you like ripples in still water. The feeling that rose was not clarity but familiarity, as though the scroll had been written by someone who had seen the same parts of the city you had. The steps by the canal, the tea-house's hush, the lanternless square and the music beneath it. The marks didn't say it outright, but they carried those places in them, not as memories but as impressions. There was one line near the centre that curved so subtly it felt like the breath of wind beneath the plum tree. Another mark, near the bottom edge, had a jagged end, like the sound of a red umbrella snapping open. You ran your thumb along the final brushstroke. It ended with a faint blotch, not quite a signature, but something close, not a name but presence. You looked up then toward the half-open door, its edge catching the light of the brazier. There was no sound from within, no footsteps, no voice, not even the soft creak of boards, and yet the feeling lingered that someone had only just stepped away. The house itself bore no markings of wealth or abandonment, just care, the wood polished not with oil but with touch, the kind of polish that takes years and 1,000 small gestures. You thought of knocking, of calling out, but something held you still. Some things are not meant to be answered aloud. So you sat instead, on the steps, the scroll resting across your knees, your lamp beside you casting its glow into the shallow hollow of the doorframe, and you waited. You did not know how much time passed before a shadow shifted behind the door, a flicker of motion, brief as the blink of starlight through passing cloud. It was not a figure exactly, more like the sense of one. And then slowly something was placed on the inner edge of the doorway, another scroll, smaller, tied with a white thread this time. The hand that placed it was quick, retreating before you could rise. You leaned forward again, but did not reach for it. Instead, you placed your own scroll beside it, the one the student had given you, the one filled with impressions from your day. A trade, a reply without words. The wind passed gently through the street then, brushing your robe and stirring the threads of the ribbon on the new scroll. You stood slowly, lifting the red bird from your robe one last time and setting it between the two scrolls like a seal. You did not knock. You did not call out. You simply turned, lifted your lamp, and walked back into the night. The city had become quiet again, but this time it didn't feel asleep. It felt like it was listening. The return walk was slower than any that had come before, not because your feet dragged with weariness, but because the city no longer asked to be hurried through. Each wall you passed, each shuttered window and faded sign, felt less like scenery and more like a participant in the story that had unfolded across the day. You moved as if wrapped in the city's own breath, and it no longer felt like something outside of you. It felt like something you had become part of again, gently but unmistakably. You passed by the bakery where the scent of morning loaves had first greeted you so many hours ago. The air now held only the faintest ghost of flour and heat, like a memory you could almost taste but not touch. The pigeons had settled into their night perches, cooing faintly from the rooftops. You turned into a narrower lane where the lanterns had all been extinguished, and for a stretch there was only moonlight to guide your steps, interrupted now and then by the silhouettes of tangled vines and the shadows of old gutters leaning into the walkways. Eventually your feet brought you back to your own doorway, a simple threshold beneath the modest eaves of your home, marked only by the barely visible carving of a sun hidden within cloud. You stood there for a moment before entering, letting the silence finish speaking. Inside, the room greeted you just as you had left it, with nothing out of place, yet everything changed by the day you had carried back within you. The mat by the window was still neatly rolled, the low table bore the same inkstone and brush you had used before, and the candle stub on the sill waited patiently for its wick to be noticed again. You placed the oil lamp on the table and sat down before it, letting your robe fall into its familiar folds around your legs. The flame cast long, soft shadows along the walls, and your fingers moved instinctively to unfold the white-threaded scroll that had been offered to you like a whisper left on a doorstep. The parchment inside was thin and dry, the kind that crackled softly with every movement. Its contents this time were written in words, not many, just a handful. No greetings, no farewell, just this. The city remembers through those who listen, and you have listened well. You held the scroll in your hands, not with reverence, but with the quiet intimacy that comes when something speaks directly to the part of you that does not often receive letters. It didn't matter who had written it. It didn't matter if they had watched you from the doorway or passed you silently in the square. What mattered was that the message had reached you, and it had not asked for anything in return. You set the scroll beside the lamp and finally, slowly, unrolled the mat beneath the window. The breeze was still drifting through the open frame, bringing with it the scent of ash, a wood, and a trace of something sweet, perhaps plum blossoms stirred early by the moon. You lay down with your eyes open for a while, watching the flame shift in the corner of your sight, your body settling into the curve of sleep, even as your mind lingered gently over the path the day had taken. And as your breath deepened, as the quiet took you not like a closing door, but like a soft hand placed on your shoulder, the last thing you saw before your eyelids fell shut was the soft flutter of the scroll's ribbon in the breeze. No grand conclusion, no final truth. Just the feeling of having arrived, not at the end, but home. Morning had not yet made up its mind. Outside your window, the sky trembled between two intentions, neither night nor day, but a gauzy, colourless drawn slowly between them. The city too seemed unsure whether to stir or stay sleeping. It held its breath just a little longer, wrapped in its robe of mist and pale light, while you lay quietly beneath your thin blanket, the mat beneath you still warm from the dreams that had not quite let go. You didn't open your eyes right away. You simply lay still, listening to the slow creak of the wooden frame as it adjusted to the shift in temperature, the far-off sigh of something soft brushing past the walls, perhaps a breeze, perhaps the footsteps of someone returning home late, or someone rising early for the markets. You felt the weight of the red bird now tucked beneath your palm, still warm from where your fingers had rested through the night. Its edges had bent just slightly, not enough to destroy the shape, only to soften it, like a memory that loses detail but not feeling. It no longer felt like a message or a symbol, it felt like a companion, like something you had carried through not just streets and rituals and lanternless festivals, but through a quiet rediscovery of what it meant to notice. You sat up slowly, careful not to startle the fragile stillness. The room had not changed, and yet it felt full now, as though everything within it had witnessed your journey and chosen wordlessly to welcome you back. You crossed to the low table where the oil lamp still stood, its flame finally gone but its scent lingering faintly in the clay of the bowl. The scroll lay beside it, ribbon now untied, its message revealed but not forgotten. You touched it lightly before rolling it back into a cylinder and slipping it into the narrow case where you kept fragments that had no other place to live. Not official records, just moments. Ashes from your first incense offering, a button carved from cherry wood, a feather once found on your sleeve after a long walk in winter. Outside, the rooftops wore the fog like shawls, edges blunted, lines softened. There were no voices yet, no clatter of carts, no echo of temple bells. It was a rare pause, one of those breaths the world sometimes took before waking, and you knew it would not last long. But for now, it belonged to you. You stepped out into the morning barefoot, your soles brushing the cool stone with familiarity. The street looked just as it had the night before, but emptier. The kind of emptiness that comes not from absence, but from anticipation. Something would arrive soon, daylight, noise, chores, but it had not arrived yet, and in that space there was peace. You began walking, not out of habit, but because the city had taught you in its quiet way that walking was a kind of conversation. You walked with your hands clasped lightly behind you, each step slow and grounded, letting your breath match the rhythm of your pace. You passed the Weaver's Quarter again, and though the doors were still closed, you heard the faint sound of fabric being shifted inside, a bolt of silk being unrolled perhaps, or a loom creaking in preparation. The world was stretching its limbs, testing its voice. You smiled at the sound, and your footsteps carried you farther. The market square had begun to stir. A single vendor knelt by her stall, arranging small clay pots in perfect rows, brushing the tops of each one with her sleeve to clear away the dust. She did not look up as you passed, but you nodded to her anyway, and she paused just long enough to return the motion before returning to her task. It was the same square where the Lantern Festival had failed to begin, but it no longer felt like a failure. It felt like the beginning of something slower, something that remembered. At the edge of the square, the boy with the ink-stained fingers stood beside a stone post, watching a fish-shaped lantern swing lazily in the morning breeze. It wasn't lit yet, but he held a match in his hand. You caught his eye, and he gave you a small, knowing smile, the kind of smile that doesn't need to explain itself. You didn't stop. He didn't follow. But the understanding hung gently in the air between you, like steam from a warm bowl of soup. You turned a corner and came once again to the canal. The water lay flat and silver, disturbed only by the ripple of a heron lifting its wings from the surface. The shrine steps were still wet from the morning dew, and you paused at the top, remembering the flute that had once echoed up from their base. There was no music today, but the silence was not empty. It was expectant. You continued walking until you reached the garden gate. It stood open once more, the plum tree within now brushed by the faintest touch of gold as the sun, uncertain but determined, began its slow rise. You stepped through and sat once again on the old bench beneath the tree. The red bird rested on your lap. You watched the light filter through the branches, casting shifting patterns onto the stone path and the folds of your robe. You closed your eyes and let the moment root itself. And then, softly, from the edge of the lane, you heard footsteps. Slow, even, deliberate. You did not look up right away, you waited. The footsteps came closer, then paused. A presence settled beside you on the bench. Still, you didn't open your eyes. Instead, you spoke gently into the quiet. I've kept listening. There was no reply, only the slow inhale of breath beside you, then the whisper of something being placed gently on the bench between you. When you opened your eyes, there it was, a new paper bird, folded from golden parchment, no message written on its wings, no symbol, just the shape, just the gesture. You turned to look at the figure beside you, but the bench was empty now. The breeze just stirring the edges of your robe, and the scent of something faintly sweet still hanging in the air. You smiled, not from surprise but from recognition. The city had responded. Not loudly, not in fanfare, just in return. You sat there until the sun had climbed high enough to erase the last of the mist, until the sounds of morning overtook the last traces of dreaming, until the red and gold birds nestled quietly in your lap, their wings brushing gently against each other with the breath of the new day. And when you finally stood, the garden watched you go, as it always had, without demand, without judgment, only memory, only presence, only listening. And the city, full of strange laws and forgotten rituals, absurd customs and quiet truth, slowly woke again beneath your feet. Not perfect, but kindled.